Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us this evening for Human Health and Ecological Resilience. I'm Jason MacArthur, the events coordinator for the Public Programs Department of the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Natalie Metz and Allison, and then I'll get right to the conversation. Natalie Metz is a licensed naturopathic doctor in practice in Oakland who focuses on women's health, botanical medicine, and digestive wellness. She is a graduate of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program and teaches in the Integrative Health Studies Department and the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, all housed at CIIS. Elizabeth Allison is Associate Professor of Ecology and Religion at CIIS, where she founded and chairs the graduate program in Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion. Dr. Allison's research and teaching explore connections between religion, ethics, and environmental practice, with particular attention to biodiversity, waste, ecological place, and climate change. And now, let me turn it over to Natalie and Elizabeth.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Good evening, Dr. Metz.
Good evening, Dr. Allison. Great to be here with you. And thank you, CIIS, for this amazing opportunity to connect with a broader group of folks around the world tonight. Thank you so much, everyone who's with us. We're delighted to be in this conversation together. So before we really dive in this evening, I would like to just invite us all to take a moment to just drop into presence together. We're going to dive down a lot of different rabbit holes this evening and touch on some interesting and tender, perhaps, material. So I wanted to invite us to just take a moment. If it feels right, you're welcome to close your eyes. Just want to bring us into a brief moment of mindfulness meditation here. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to close my eyes for a moment and just invite us to bring our attention to the breath. Just noticing what's happening as breath comes into your body and leaves your body. And also inviting us to notice that place where our bodies interface with essentially Mother Earth. Perhaps there's a chair, a couch, a floor, some surface where your body's making contact, and just invite you to bring some awareness to that space, that interface. And to remember that we are in contact with the earth. We are in contact with this beautiful planet all the time. Just taking a few more breaths together. Offering a little gratitude to ourselves, whatever it took to show up here this evening, or wherever you are on the planet, whatever time zone you're in. Just acknowledging what it takes to be on this human journey, in this time, in this place. And if it's available, to consider sending a little bit of love and compassion out to the globe right now. I'm going to ring this bell. Thank you. And before we dive further in, I want to just want to acknowledge this evening that it's a privilege that we're able to sit here together, that Dr. Allison and I are able to be on Zoom, that we're able to have technology and homes to sit within and to connect with in order to be in contact this evening. And I just want to name that we're doing our best to be aware of our own privilege, our positionality, As we go into this conversation this evening, there are some areas in which we have our own places of awareness and expertise. And then there's also plenty of places where we don't know what we don't know. So we just want to acknowledge that right from the bat. And I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Allison.
Thank you so much, Dr. Natalie, for that wonderful grounding meditation, especially appropriate because our conversation has to do with human health and our place on planet Earth and how we relate to Earth, where we find our support at all times. To preview where we're going to go tonight, as we've planned this conversation, we're going to talk first about just basic background of the current coronavirus crisis. And we're going to highlight some unprecedented aspects of this pandemic that make it really a unique moment in human history. And a framing device we have for understanding the pandemic is that it's an unveiling. And I'll say a bit about that in a moment. So we'll talk about what does it unveil for us? What can it help us see that we couldn't see before? And then we'll consider, where do we go from here? And that piece is really an invitation into a larger generative conversation that we hope can continue beyond this conversation. As we chatted with each other, we realized that this current pandemic situation opens up so many more questions than it answers. And so in that final part, we'll pose some of those questions that have occurred to us. I mentioned that the pandemic is an unveiling. And why do I say that? Well, many people have been talking about a sort of apocalyptic moment, like it's the end of the world or it's an apocalypse. And if we look at the derivation of that term, apocalypse, it comes from the Church Latin, meaning revelation, and from the Greek, apokalyptein, meaning to uncover, disclose, or reveal, which is apo, that's off or away, and kalyptein, which is to cover or conceal. So apocalypse literally means to uncover or to reveal. And if we look back at that original meaning, it kind of gives us some leverage for investigating what's going on at this moment. Other people have talked about the pandemic as a disaster, also, as a sort of cataclysmic event. And interestingly, that term too has a deeper meaning coming from the Latin again for star, astro, and then dis, not or negative. So it's a disaster is living under a bad star. So if we're living under a bad star, or if we're facing a moment of revelation, what might we find, or what might we dig into at this time? And that's what Dr. Natalie and I want to discuss.
Yeah. So I would like to just thank you, Dr. Allison, for that wonderful framing here. And I would like to just toss out there that, what we're looking at here essentially is what I consider to be a paradigmatic problem. It's a discord between the enchanted versus the disenchanted universe, if you will, the holistic paradigm versus the non-holistic, or perhaps even the allopathic in the medical lingo, so to speak. And I really believe that it's this paradigmatic discord that has gotten us into this mess and really perpetuates it. And in the holistic paradigm, we take a look at the whole, and we understand that the whole is not just the sum of its parts. It's actually an integrated, interconnected, vibrant, living system that emerges out of all of the component parts, and that when we reduce things down, we don't necessarily get representation of the whole. And the reductionist, materialist, essentially postmodern scientific paradigm is one that I think has really contributed to the problems that we're seeing right now. And another way to take this paradigm into account is to take a look at the human body as a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosmic Earth, the planetary organism that we refer to as Gaia. And so COVID-19, coronavirus, is but one representation of a human manifestation of an illness that's happening on a much larger level, on the planetary level. And essentially, when we look at what's happening with COVID and we look at what's happening with Gaia, we see that essentially everyone is in an inflammatory state, the human beings, the planet. And this pandemic is really a symptom of climate change, systemic illnesses that are deeper. I wanted to just make note of a few really interesting things that came on my radar in the past couple weeks. First is something called Sentinel, which is an early warning system that was designed to detect and track the next pandemic. It was introduced in a TED Talk in January of 2020. There's interesting follow-up to that in April. Bill Gates back in 2015 on TED gave a talk entitled "We Are Not Ready for the Next Epidemic," and also demonstrated a model based on the 1918 Spanish flu that predicted that the next pandemic would potentially result in over 33 million deaths. And interestingly enough, there was something called Event 201 on October 18th, 2019, where members from the Gates Foundation, Johns Hopkins University, and the World Economic Forum had what they called the pandemic exercise to illustrate our level of preparedness. So there has been, at least on some level in the consciousness, a mindfulness towards the possibility of this pandemic happening. And since we have planned this discussion, which was supposed to be really oriented around human health and ecological resilience, the world has erupted in a way that we couldn't perceive. And there is ongoing painful revelation around systemic illnesses, including racism, the extent of police brutality we're seeing here in the United States. And we just want to say that we're aware that racism is also a global pandemic, as is sexism and classism and ableism. And again, we're doing our best to focus on our areas of expertise tonight and acknowledge that we have blind spots. With that said, I do want to acknowledge also that we are on the eve of Juneteenth, which is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. And the further I dive into these rabbit holes, the more my heart breaks as I learn about the details of people suffering around the globe. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Allison, for some background on the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Natalie. So that we begin this conversation on the same page, we wanted to just discuss a little bit on the background of the pandemic. So the novel coronavirus has never before been seen in humans. That's why it's novel. Viruses are quintessential parasites. They're non-living entities that have to hijack living cells in order to reproduce. And of course, as you know in the news, the formal name is SARS-CoV-2. The disease caused by the coronavirus is COVID-19, short for corona, C-O-V-I, virus, and D for disease. 19 because it began in 2019. The first reports of this new unknown pneumonia were coming out of China in late December 2019. And of course, by now it's spread around the globe. There hasn't been a pandemic of this reach since the 1918 global influenza pandemic. If we look at a few other pandemics, we might think of HIV, but of course, coronavirus that is transmitted through aerosols and droplets spreads much easier than HIV. HIV has killed 32 million people since the early 1980s, but these days people can live with HIV. In comparison, the 1918 flu pandemic killed 675,000 people in the US and approximately 50 million worldwide. Hopefully we don't get to that level. At this point though, we've seen already 450,000 global deaths from COVID-19, and there are more than 8.4 million cases of COVID-19 around the world. In the US, there are around 118,000 deaths already in the past few months, and around 2.17 million cases of COVID-19 in the US as of today. So obviously a very serious challenge to humanity, and really emphasizes our connection with the natural world. It brings into greater awareness, and this is one of the ways it unveils or reveals the connection between human and non-human animals. So the current understanding of coronavirus is that it's a zoonotic disease that most likely jumped from bats, possibly to an intermediate host, maybe pangolins, and then to humans. And this really emphasizes the influence of the non-human world on human society. As Dr. Natalie mentioned at the beginning, there have been many predictions that there would be an epidemic outbreak of some type, and ecologists have really predicted that it would be a zoonotic disease. As humans live in closer proximity to wildlife, and as humans draw on bushmeat for protein, human and non-human life become much more intertwined. In his 2012 book, Spillover, the science writer David Quammen described the terrifying effects of these various zoonotic diseases. At that time, Ebola was known, but of course, the novel coronavirus wasn't known at that time. And as humans clear more forests and fragment forests and live in closer proximity with wildlife, it's likely that we will continue to experience these outbreaks of zoonotic disease that jump from non-humans to humans. So this really drives home the interconnection of human well-being and ecological well-being. And as we think about this appearance of a novel virus, I wonder, Dr. Natalie, what are the implications of experiencing a novel virus for the human immune system?
So one of the big considerations is just that it's novel, and we don't have essentially any treatments in the dominant medical paradigm's arsenal, so to speak. So as it stands right now, we don't have any quote unquote treatment or prophylaxis in the dominant medical system for COVID-19. And sadly, actually not that much has changed since we started becoming aware of this pandemic as it was emerging. I was reviewing some notes that I sent out to friends back, timestamped March 13th, where recommendations were to wash your hands and cover your mouth if you sneeze, and that was pretty much what we more or less still have. So we have essentially a situation where we have inadequate testing, we have inadequate treatment that leaves us very vulnerable and susceptible. But again, that is primarily in what we call the dominant medical system, the allopathic medical system. And from the holistic paradigm, there's a lot that we can do, because we organize our thoughts in the holistic and vitalistic paradigm around supporting the innate intelligence of the organism to heal itself. And so in the case of the human body, as a naturopathic doctor, I would look to see what might I be able to do to help this person reduce their stress in their life and boost their immune system and find more meaning and joy in their life, just as an example. And we have this concept that it's the milieu, not the microbe, meaning that it's the environment. It's not the bug itself. It's not the staph infection. It's what is the context? What is the environmental conditions that allowed the virus to emerge in such a way that it has now become so problematic? What's so interesting about viruses, of course, is they're not actually even alive. They are not entities. They produce their own. They actually have to hijack the cellular machinery of another organism in order to replicate themselves. And another interesting piece about the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 is its affinity to attach to the ACE2 receptors in the lungs. And I find this pretty significant because we're seeing that people who fall into more severe illness at the end stage drown in their own fluids, they drown in their own lung secretions. And from the perspective of Chinese medicine, the lungs are the organ that house the emotion grief. And if you're not grieving at this point in time on the planet, then I don't know. I don't know what you're doing, but there's a lot to be grieving right now. And I'll turn that back to you, Dr. Allison.
Well, that really, that point about grief is really fascinating to me, because we're starting to have so much more awareness of ecological grief and climate anxiety among scientists who study environmental degradation and climate change and biodiversity loss, but even among regular folks who read the news or watch the news, and learn about the tremendous loss of biological diversity, and the projections of warming climate. And so raising this point about grief makes me feel like there's a sort of a global, even before the pandemic, there was a global epidemic of grief. And of course, grief around racism and police brutality too, that has been very long standing, but perhaps not always recognized as much as it needs to be. So I would say that there was a huge epidemic of grief even before this current virus pandemic. It's interesting to note that the virus really takes up residence in the lungs, and that is associated with grief in the traditional Chinese medicine system. And eco-psychologists are coining new terms to identify and name these feelings of ecological grief, like psychoteric distress and environmental melancholia. The Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht came up with the term solastalgia, which is the sort of grief that a person experiences when their home changes irrevocably around them. And we certainly see that with urbanization and destruction of forests and melting glaciers because of climate change. So the microcosm and the macrocosm are really resonant here on this issue of grief. So we have this really unprecedented pandemic. What are some of the particular aspects of this unprecedented pandemic that you've noticed?
Sure, thank you. Well, first and foremost, that it is a pandemic at all, meaning that it has, encompassed the globe, and this disease process is showing up all over the planet. I think it's also really important to note that the disparities in health, in access to health care and socioeconomic status are really being highlighted here. We're seeing more deaths in low income populations, as well as people of color and indigenous communities such as the Dene Nation. I've been tuning into the press conferences hosted by the World Health Organization. And again, on this theme of societal injustice and racism, Dr. Michael Ryan, who's the executive director of the WHO Health Emergencies Program, said yesterday, "It is entirely unacceptable that access to healthcare anywhere in the world would be influenced by race. It should be based on clinical need." Yet that's just not the truth. That's the living reality for many people around the world. And really COVID-19 is essentially a drop in the bucket for many of these marginalized populations. On yesterday's WHO press conference, there was also a delegate from the Neglected Tropical Disease Division. This is diseases around the world that don't get a lot of attention, such as leprosy. And the delegate from that aspect of the WHO was saying, the people with leprosy, they're not worried about COVID. I mean, they've got bigger fish to fry, essentially. And there was also open acknowledgement by the WHO that racism is a pandemic. And Dr. Tedros, who's the Director General, described COVID as a very dangerous virus that's moving fast and killing, at a rapid pace. And he really posited that the answer is unity and solidarity. And I really appreciate that he's putting that out there and calling for that across the world, unity and solidarity and humanity at a time that we've never seen. And now, we have the technology, we have the means. We don't all have the technology, but we have some infrastructure in place. I hope we can use it. Dr. Maria, the tech lead, also highlighted the reality that all countries need to be prepared to be the next epicenter. There were a lot of questions about what's happening in Brazil as the numbers are increasing there. And also that when we're thinking about designating epicenters, we need to be thinking about the prevalence of the disease in the area. Can people do the things needed to mitigate and reduce exposure and transmission? Like, can people actually maintain distance or wear masks? What is the capacity in the local area to detect and trace and treat? We need to really be investigating and continuing. Seeing that this isn't possible in certain communities, especially for example, neighbor reservation in northern Arizona and northern New Mexico. These are a group of people that are used to living in community in a way that where social isolation is just not even really an option. And also, there were many questions about air travel, of course. Dr. Michael Ryan responded to that, saying that there's more risk in a plane, of course, than in the airport itself, but that we also really need to be thinking about establishing tracking systems for travelers. And that, of course, brings up questions around civil liberties. If people are going to be tracked everywhere that they move, what does that mean? He also noted that surfaces, people ask about surface transmission. He said, you know, it's really hard to consistently disinfect every single surface as much as it might need to be. And then the question about temperature screening, you know, not all cases of COVID present with a fever. So is screening someone before they come into a restaurant or a hair salon adequate? Who knows? There's really, again, more questions than answers. The last thing that the WHO commented on that I thought was really interesting was, will there be a second lockdown, if you will? And Dr. Michael Ryan said that it's really important to think about our surveillance measures. The less sensitive our surveillance measures are, the more blunt our intervention measures are. Essentially, we can't see where to focus in the dark. So on one hand, again, we need more surveillance and tracking and tracing, but we also want to be mindful of civil liberties. You know, this non-living particle, this virus, has essentially
It's upset
of
global.
This time is unprecedented. Sorry, did I cut out? Yeah, it's unprecedented. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's just an unprecedented time in terms of the economic disruption. Here in the United States, we're seeing the national unemployment rate of almost 15%. We've got schools shutting down, shifting to online education, travel disruption, mass migration across India on foot. Lots and lots more we could say about that, but essentially the pandemic is allowing us to see certain aspects more readily. And Dr. Allison, please take us into that place.
Right. So we were talking a lot about what can be unveiled. What are we seeing through this pandemic? And we note that uncertainty is one of the dynamics being unveiled in the modern paradigm, where we're used to being able to fly in a plane here or there, get our information readily. At this point, we can't get information. As Dr. Natalie was just explaining, there's still so many unknowns about the nature of the coronavirus, how it's transmitted, and what the severity is, and how it's treated. So this is bringing us into a time of greater uncertainty and unpredictability, which is really in parallel with what has been predicted about climate change as well, that climate instability will lead to greater unpredictability as far as weather regimes, as far as what to predict for agricultural planting, for example, or severity of storms. And so in tandem, these two pandemics of climate change and COVID-19 are shifting us, revealing this new phase of uncertainty and unpredictability. They're also revealing our deep, deep dependence on nature. We talked about how zoonotic diseases arise from human friction with non-human nature. We're also noting that the confluence of environmental toxicity is giving rise to potentially a greater suffering from COVID-19, especially because air pollution, which also damages the lungs, can potentially increase the severity of a COVID-19 illness. This has unveiled for us the difficulty with industrialized meat in an industrialized society. We've seen really rapid spread of COVID-19 among meat workers who may be, well, they're considered essential workers, but they may or may not have good access to health care. So many animals have had to be slaughtered because of inability to process them with meat workers out sick. We know that cattle production creates a huge amount of methane, which leads to climate change. We know that land use conversion in the Amazon also contributes to climate change. So we really see this imbrication of COVID and climate change around meat issues. And we also see this sort of narrative of disposability arising, where different groups of people have been sort of targeted as disposable. Essential workers without their necessary protective gear, older people, when early rhetoric around, well, it's only older people who are going to get sick, like somehow that's okay. So an amazing quote that summarizes this dynamic of disposability came from Hop Hopkins, writing in Sierra Magazine this week. And he said, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. You can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. And I think that we've really, again, had an unveiling of racism and police brutality over the past month or so, bringing so much greater awareness to the American public about what a serious pandemic racism is in the US. So these are some of the unveilings we've seen. Certainly there have been disparate impacts of COVID-19 on different racial and ethnic communities. Do you want to talk more about that, Dr. Natalie?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And again, I just want to acknowledge that, what we might be referring to at times as an unveiling of a pandemic of racism is also not new news to many people. That many people are living that reality every single day. And so some of the concerns I have about what's being brought forth is really this fear conditioning on one hand. We're now being taught to have fear of hugs, fear of planes, fear of others. This process of xenophobia just continues to expand. Be fearful of that group of people or that country or they're the ones that did this thing. Not a helpful aspect to what's happening, in my opinion. There are racially disparate impacts of COVID tied into largely the socioeconomic system. Again, we have environmental racism. We're seeing disparate impacts in low income, people of color, indigenous communities. We know that structural racism shapes the access that people have to things like clean air and water and safe neighborhoods and school and fresh food. All of these aspects are important for supporting well-being and longevity. And the lack of these, alongside an increased exposure to toxic stress, contributes to conditions like heart disease and diabetes, two conditions that are asthma as well, three conditions that are known to worsen the course of COVID-19 illness. And our wonderful Shmi Giratana said today in a conversation earlier, if your life already feels threatened every day by your existence, then how does the threat of COVID land? So again, just trying to get outside of our boxes of privilege and positionality and consider what it's like for other people who are threatened by their very existence, perhaps. There's all sorts of air and water. We have some data from the American Journal of Public Health here that is talking about people in poverty having almost 1.5 times exposure to particulate matter in air than the overall population. People of color also in that range. And African Americans having a 54% higher chance of being exposed to particulate emissions, which again aggravates asthma and heart disease. And another interesting part of that is that Blacks and Latinos are noted to breathe in more air pollution than what they produce, excuse me, whereas whites breathe in 17% less than what they actually produce. And we have countless statistics coming out of Chicago, Milwaukee County, the state of Louisiana, showing that Black people are representing 60 to 70% of deaths from COVID, although they're only making up about a third of the city or the region's population. Same thing in New York City, Latinx people are dying with more than double the rate compared to white people. We still have questions out there about places like Flint, Michigan. Is the water actually safe to drink there? Who really knows? Same thing in Brooklyn. Many school systems around the nation. Again, we're seeing the denation in northern Arizona, northern New Mexico being really hardly hit. They have the highest infection rate per capita. 44% of the people on the reservation are living below the poverty line. A third of them are without electricity and running water, and mining operations are using local water to slurry coal downstream, and people can't use the water that's on the land. I mean, it's really sick. And then we have, of course, all sorts of challenges with incarcerated people and refugees in crowded spaces where it's not possible to maintain proper hygiene and social distancing. Whew, okay,
Oh.
I know, it's intense. Just to take another deeper look here at what's happening with healthcare as it relates to COVID. Some of the good news is that 80% of the cases are mild. But of course, you don't want to be one of those people that's in that 20 percentile. Common symptoms include fever, fatigue, dry cough, potentially a disorder in smell or taste, sometimes GI distress. Again, we have to think about things like access to care and testing and treatment. The testing is not 100% at this point. I mean, there is no test that is 100%, but when we're thinking about a validated test or the possibility of a test being validated, we want to think about how sensitive it is and how specific it is. Is it sensitive enough to detect what we're looking for? And is it specific enough to detect that compared to anything else that might be in the sample? So we don't at this point have tons of FDA validated tests. So the testing is kind of a big question about false negatives and false positives. We have the WHO something called the Solidarity clinical trial, where they're looking at 4 different drugs in terms of treating COVID patients. Many of these drugs come with wonderful side effects such as liver toxicity and psychosis, and heart and pancreas toxicity, suicidal depression. As of Monday, the FDA in the United States revoked its emergency use decision for the drug hydroxychloroquine, which is commonly used for the treatment or prophylaxis of malaria. And also the WHO decided to pull that out of their Solidarity trial because they decided there's just not enough evidence. They say it's unlikely to be effective and there are serious side effects, such as psychosis. And then also alongside this challenge where people stockpiled this drug initially, states and countries stockpiled this drug, making it less available to patients who rely on it, like people who have lupus. So there are all sorts of layers of problems here. The latest drug to have some news around it is a steroid called dexamethasone. And preliminary data from the UK recovery trial just released a few days ago has shown that patients who are on oxygen, so these are really severe COVID patients who are on oxygen had a reduction in their mortality by about 1/5. Those who are ventilated had a reduction in their mortality by about 1/3. So we're really talking, 20 to 30% of those severe cases had some improvement with this steroid drug. It's not being recommended for prophylaxis or for mild cases, but contrary to what we might think about it being perhaps a miracle, steroids are actually known to be associated with viral replication. So these are, again, really end-stage patients that are getting this treatment, but it's not something that people should be doing on the regular. And then the last 2 points here, just, we have these huge questions coming up around essential versus non-essential care. So many people have had their quote unquote non-essential healthcare pushed to the side, on one hand to reduce the potential of exposure in a healthcare facility, but also to divert the resources in the healthcare system to the COVID patient. But who's to determine what's essential, right? If you have a mole that you feel like needs to be checked out, or you think that your heart's about to explode, that might seem really essential to you. And then we have, of course, a shift towards telehealth and telemedicine versus in-person care. And that brings up more questions about accessibility. Does everybody have the opportunity to be on the phone or a computer to check in with their doctor? again, endless rabbit holes we could go down here. And so as we're looking further into this exploration about what's essential and not non-essential, I'm curious, Dr. Allison, if you'd like to comment a bit about how this relates to the environment, the labor force, some other aspects here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that summary. Certainly, the access to, as you were saying, telecommunications is even that is there's disparate access, right? Um, and some of our lowest paid workers in, for example, stores and food delivery services and so on have been deemed essential workers. So are out there potentially at risk of illness without good benefits, without necessarily good access to healthcare, or without paid days off for illness. So this definitely brings to mind the need to reform our healthcare system. Um, of course, farm workers are absolutely foundationally essential for all of us to eat, and yet often lack health insurance, lack paid days off, may lack safety gear. And we talked about meat factory workers earlier. And when we think about human dependence on intact ecosystems, the pandemic really brings our awareness to that. It also brings our awareness to the way that nature can rebound when humans retreat a bit. And we have seen in various places a bit of rewilding as humans are sheltering in place. We're not out everywhere these days. So probably in social media or in news articles, you've seen some of these stories about mountain lions strolling through Boulder, Colorado, or wild boars racing through Barcelona, or bears and bobcats having fun in Yosemite Valley because there aren't so many campers there. We can see that nature can heal when humans retreat a bit. And that also reminds us of the healing power of nature itself. So as we are sheltering in place, one of the few treats that we have, many of us, is daily walks. We're allowed to leave our house for exercise or for walking. And we know that being in nature has many benefits, physiological benefits for people, as well as psychological benefits. The practice of forest bathing in Japan has become, was very popular even before this, but has revealed that people who participate in forest bathing have lower blood pressure and lower heart rate. Their cortisol goes down. And so this is one of these practices that we can probably safely engage in even during the pandemic shutdown, engaging with nature and then perhaps improving our own resilience in the face of COVID-19. So we definitely see a lot of these connections. Of course, we've seen a decrease in carbon emissions over the last several months. And this is a hopeful sign in regard to climate change, but it's also probably temporary. So one question I want to raise is, are there changes that we've experienced over the last several months that we might want to institute over the longer term to help us reach some of our climate change goals to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? But that does require a major shift in business as usual. And so I think we can really see the COVID pandemic as an example of climate change, our first real challenge of climate change, where the human imbrication with the planet becomes unveiled, becomes incredibly transparent to us. And the same dynamics that drive climate change, like overconsumption, greed, wastefulness, disregard for nature, are also driving the COVID pandemic. So hopefully we can use this moment as a wake-up call and change our relations with nature and ecosystems and Gaia as a whole, so that we can avoid future catastrophes. So, Dr. Natalie, there's a planetary perspective. And as we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, embedded in the English language is the idea that stars influence life on Earth. Disaster is living under a bad star. Influenza comes from the medieval Latin influence, based on the notion that epidemics were influenced by the stars. So if we were to zoom out and take even a broader view of this apocalypse, what might we see?
Yes, well, as a graduate of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program and a student and stand off, I must speak just a little bit to the exposition of these archetypal energies through the lens of astrology. And we're currently coming to the end of a really potent transit where the outer planets Pluto and Uranus have been in a square since 2007. And the last time that these planets were in hard aspect was during the 1960s. And we know that there were lots of different revolutionary energies in the 1960s, especially here in the United States, all sorts of different movements that characterize the energy of these two planets, Uranus being the energy of liberation, creativity, innovation, sometimes explosive, unexpected events, and Pluto, a volcanic, deep, dark, creative, but also shadowy aspects of the universe type of archetypal energy. And so specifically in the past 14 years, we've been in this hard aspect of Uranus, Pluto in a square, and bringing up lots of different issues. And in the past couple of months, we've entered into even more influence from other planets, including Jupiter and Mars and Saturn, where we've seen even more of an eruption of these energies and the breakdown of structures. Societal structures are breaking down. We're seeing this in the healthcare system. We're seeing this in the quote unquote criminal justice system. We're seeing breakdown of structures everywhere. We're seeing new things being brought into the light, if you will. And so I offer that we, essentially we have astrology as a map to look towards in the realm of potentiality. So for those of you who are inclined, I invite you to consider taking a look at the astrology of the moment and consider how we might be able to work with this, especially as we come out of the Uranus Pluto square. Yeah, and then
Cool.
Yeah, we'll take a look here at a little bit more of what's happening with unveiling and resilience.
Right. So it seems like astrology actually can be a tool for cultivating resilience, because it can be a way of thinking paradigmatically, right? And putting the current moment into a larger context. But I'm sure in your naturopathic health practice, you have other practices of personal resilience. Do you want to talk about those?
Sure. Yeah. So first, I just want to give a little voice to something called the window of tolerance. And this is, I think, a helpful conceptual tool for all of us. So within the window of tolerance is where we get stuff done, essentially. And when we're above our window of tolerance, we're in a state of hyper arousal. We're anxious, we're maybe manic, we're frantic. It's hard to focus. And yet when we're in a state of hypo arousal, we might be depressed, lethargic. And so whenever we're trying to get stuff done or process anything in life, it's ideal to stay within this window of tolerance. And this is a concept from psychology, I think, helpful. And resilience, as defined by the American Psychological Association, is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It not only helps you to get through difficult circumstances, but empowers you to grow and improve your life along the way. Resilience is demonstrated in human beings all across the planet, as well as in the ecological systems. I find that it's really helpful to tune into myself and just kind of check in, where am I, to take inventory on the various aspects of my being, my mental, emotional, physical, social, sexual, spiritual well-being, to take some inventory and really sit with myself. I personally have a daily meditation practice. I'm really into smoothies and superfoods. Nutrition for me is a really deep practice of resilience. And I think that as we look to society and the ways that we're going to need to have some practices in place to recover from this time, we're going to really need to prioritize relationships with other people and perhaps in new ways, and build connections and find ways to foster wellness and find purpose, especially in these times. If you know, the staying at home, sheltering in place goes on for longer for some of us, you know, we might need to seek some professional help as needed as well. How about for you, Dr. Allison? What are some things that help you?
Yeah, for me, I've been really leaning into my yoga practice, and I'm so grateful that my teachers are offering courses online. And that's actually one of the gifts of this time, is that it's possible to take a course with a teacher, you know, anywhere, not just the local Berkeley teachers. Um, I think that meditation and sinking into the present moment, where we can realize that we are um, in, if we're fortunate in this moment, we are safe, and hopefully we're healthy, and recognize that we have that at this moment. Um, a lot of teachers are talking about gratitude as well, to the extent that we have safe housing, have a full fridge, if we have a job. These are all incredible things to be grateful for in this moment. And you know, Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects, is really helpful too in um, moving from this into this open-hearted space, um, to uh, to build resilience, and to recognize the strengths and the foundations that we have, and then look into the change that we desire, the great turning that we desire for a more sustainable world. But it's interesting to hear these ideas about human resilience, because they really remind me also of ecological resilience, which is defined as the amount of disturbance an ecosystem can withstand without changing into a new system. Um, and some of the factors that contribute to resilient ecosystems are diversity, biological diversity, redundancy, functional redundancy within systems, connectivity between systems and within systems, um, slow variables and feedback loops within systems so that change can be moderated, learning within systems. And when I think about what you've shared around resilience and human health in the face of COVID, I really see a lot of parallels with ecological resilience and ways that we might weave these factors of ecological resilience into our human systems, as far as diversity, redundancy, recognizing feedback loops. So maybe that's another aspect that might be able to be carried forward, um, perhaps after this pandemic, when we get to that time. Are there other teachings from your naturopathic practice that you would want to share?
Yeah, I'd like to offer a few kind of consensus recommendations from the naturopathic perspective. But before I do that, I'd like to just highlight a little bit of resilience research from Lucy Hone. I listened to a great TED talk of hers recently where she said adversity does not discriminate. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And she describes three characteristics of resilient people. One is the understanding that suffering is part of human existence. Second, that resilient people are good at choosing where to put their attention and to distinguish between what they can and cannot change, as well as they're good at asking themselves, is what I'm doing actually helping or harming me? So really pointing to the power of self-compassion. So I'm a big proponent of self-compassion and compassion for all. I also think it's really helpful to look at and cultivate practices of contemplation and also expression. So for some people that might be meditation or quieting the mind or yoga. And for some people that an expressive practice might look like dance or drawing or writing or things like that. But again, I think it's important to just keep in mind that not everybody has the tools to learn how to cultivate those practices, or has a full fridge, or sees nature as a resource, or sees nature as a place of refuge. Some people are actually fearful of nature. So I just wanted to name that. So in addition to the things that are being generally recommended by the medical system, such as washing your hands, wearing masks, being mindful of social distancing, from the naturopathic perspective, we're encouraging people to drink lots of water, Ideally at least 2 liters a day for most adults. That's about 64 ounces. To consider eating a primarily vegetarian diet of whole organic foods with lots of fresh veggies and fruits, and specifically to reduce or avoid red meat, pork, dairy, and gluten because they're very pro-inflammatory to the system, along with refined sugar, processed foods, caffeine, alcohol, and tobacco. All these things tend to inflame the system, and we are inflamed as the people. In terms of, and before I say the rest of this, let me just say, I have to just acknowledge that I am not your doctor, and therefore I am not diagnosing or treating you. But I am happy to share these naturopathic notions here. So supplements that can be helpful, increasing one's intake of vitamin C, ideally about 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day. Same thing with vitamin D, 2 to 5,000 IUs a day, vitamin A, 25,000 IUs a day. Zinc, the mineral zinc, 50 to 75 milligrams a day. These are all known to boost and be supportive in helping the body to mitigate viruses. N-acetylcysteine is a specific amino acid that's very mucolytic in the system, meaning it breaks up mucus. It also helps to manage the parts of our immune system that create allergic reactions. And its acronym is NAC, N-acetylcysteine. It's advised to take between 500 and 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day. And then probiotics, the good bugs that live in our gut, at least 20 billion colony forming units a day with a blend of lactobacillus and bifidobacter strains. There are several herbs that are known to be supportive to the immune system and overall health, such as elderberry, echinacea, other respiratory and lung herbs such as Osha, elecampane, and yerba santa might be useful during this time, as well as mushrooms like turkey tail and reishi that have a long legacy of being essentially longevity tonics in Chinese medicine. The homeopathic remedy bryonia has emerged as a potential support, and a really fun at-home treatment one can do is hydrotherapy in the shower. So ending your shower with hot and cold rinses, starting with hot and then ending with cold, ideally alternating 3 times, going a little bit warm and then going cold, starting hot, ending cold. That's a really easy way to help remind your system that it can boost itself to be a little more agile. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to have those resources to boost our immune systems at home. And so to conclude, we want to look back where we've been. We shared the background of COVID-19 and some intersections with climate change and ecological degradation. We looked at the unprecedented aspects. We looked at what's being revealed. How is this apocalypse a revelation or an unveiling? And then we discussed how we might develop human and ecological resilience in that context. And as we mentioned at the beginning, this conversation for us has raised more questions than answers. And so we want to pose this as a sort of a generative discussion and think about, are there changes that have happened or are happening during the COVID pandemic that might be changes we'd like to institute into society as a whole to create more sustainable societies, maybe like universal healthcare or universal basic income? Are there ethical changes that we might need, like a more communal ethic that focuses on the collectivity rather than only my individual freedom to do whatever I want, whenever I want? Are there ways that we may need to moderate our freedom in a liberal society to recognize the well-being and the needs of others? In the US, we've really focused on our own individual freedom, but it seems to be coming at some cost, and certainly that freedom has contributed to racism, right? If my certain person's freedom to do whatever then causes harm to another person. So we might reconsider our ethical formulations, our ethical foundations, our notions of freedom. We might better examine interconnectedness and how we are interconnected with not only other humans, but non-human nature, as well as these particles that aren't even living, these viruses that have now woven their way into our society and indeed disrupted the global economic system in a really unprecedented way. And who would have thought that a non-living particle could bring the global economic system to a halt? So maybe we reconceptualize interconnection in certain ways. These are some of the ideas that come to me, Dr. Natalie. Do you have other things that you're hoping we can, other questions that we want to leave with, or other things we want to reconceptualize?
Well, I just want to reemphasize that essentially we need an overhaul on all systems. We're, you know, this COVID-19 pandemic is really highlighting the fragility that's within the systems, and the levels of oppression of various marginalized peoples, whether that's based on gender or sexual expression or identity or ethnic background. There's just so many systemic problems. So I'm really just calling for an overhaul of systems, healthcare, politics, environmental care. I just think that we need to continue to ask ourselves the really difficult questions that, you know, what can I do on my personal, in my day-to-day that can be mindful of the whole, and not to sacrifice, become a martyr necessarily, but to just be mindful that everything that we do has an impact on everyone else, every other being on this planet. And so I think we can do things like, you know, put our prayers or our energy or our intentions towards the well-being of the whole at this point in time. I think that we can extend our energy into the noosphere, this concept that there's a mind or a heart or a soul of the earth, if you will. We can put our energies out there. And I also would like to see more of these conversations happen, invite more interdisciplinary conversation, and bring forth more underrepresented voices in the communities. I really think we need to think about how we are decolonizing our minds, our hearts, our souls, and to think about the ecology of our mind, our heart, our soul, the environment, and beyond. And to consider what we can do with our agency and with our quote unquote free will, if that is indeed a thing that we have. I think that's about what I've got in the moment, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from the audience.
Sounds great. Thank you for such a stimulating interdisciplinary conversation. It's been really fascinating to think through these issues of human and ecological well-being with you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much, Dr. Allison.
Shall we turn it over to questions?
Yeah, let's open it up for some questions.
So I think the questions are going to appear in the chat. Oh, they're
in the Q&A tab.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have the first question. What do you think about the correlation of white supremacy being a major factor of climate change, since the history of the ideology has affected our relationship with nature and connection to the earth? Yeah, absolutely. I think that white supremacy and colonialism are historically absolutely intertwined with climate change and created climate change. The history of Western science and colonial extraction has led us to this point where humans have really become out of balance with Earth. And I think that human beings will not get a grip on climate change. We will not be able to respond appropriately until we address the racial trauma, certainly at the heart of American history and at the heart of histories of many other countries as well. Certainly recognizing the genocide of the indigenous people of this land, as well as the enslaved people who built American society, is absolutely essential to not only repairing our society, but coming into greater equity and justice with non-human nature, with ecosystems as well. Dr. Natalie, do you want to add?
Yeah, I want to echo what you've said, but also I think that we just have a lot of hard work before us to do around, on one hand, preventing, ideally stopping and preventing the continued transmission of intergenerational trauma. And then, doing the hard work of looking at ourselves and finding out where our own implicit biases exist, looking at the ways in which we are perpetuating the narrative of racism and various types of supremacy and othering. I think that we have, on one hand, kind of our personal work to do, and I'm grateful that there are lots of movements and organizations out there that can help us to do that work on the personal level, but then we also really need to take it to the collective and to think about how we want to rewrite the narratives and how we want to restructure the conversation for our children's children, looking 7 generations behind and 7 generations forward. Like, we have a responsibility, I feel, to be mindful in the present moment. And yeah, this notion of intergenerational trauma and trauma in general it's like, of course, when people are hurt, they're more apt to hurt others. And it's like, what is, how do we get back to understanding what that, in my opinion, original soul hurt is, that original type of soul loss that someone's experienced that's influencing the further perpetuation of cycles of abuse and trauma. So yeah.
Thank you for.
And just one thing to add to that too is, again, to acknowledge that not every group of people has access to the resources. So I feel like it's a bit of a conundrum on some level to say, oh, let's do our trauma work, but not everybody has access to the resources or support to do that work. So I just want to name that. I again, more questions than answers in some way, but I'm certainly in support of us looking at this and being really mindful of how our implicit biases continue to put us in places of privilege and positionality.
Right. So maybe we need to increase access to that intergenerational trauma work and to therapeutic counseling. And I mean, we need an increase of access also, right?
Yeah, big time.
Yeah, great.
Our next question here from Padu we've got is, how do we coexist with nature in healthy ways that can help us avoid pandemics like COVID-19 in the future? I'll just take a quick initial pass at that, which is, we have to essentially stop living in this anthropocentric way. We are so focused on what's good for our human being, our human embodied selves, and we have to open up our minds and hearts and souls to being a global citizen, being perhaps even a citizen of the cosmos, if you will. PCC Professor Brian Swim has said that perhaps the human being is a place in the universe where consciousness shows up with a self-reflexive capacity. And so if we as human beings have the capacity to reflect upon our actions, to reflect upon what we've done in our lives or throughout generations, then perhaps we have a responsibility to chart a new course forward. And so we've got to, get off the fossil fuels. We've got to probably stop eating as much meat. I'll let you say more to that, Dr.
Sure.
Allison.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I think the best way that we can, or maybe the 2 best ways that we can coexist with nature to avoid pandemics in the future, that is to stop eating meat, because that drives rainforest destruction, that drives human incursion into really remote, relatively pristine forests that we need for habitat and biological diversity. We have to allow some spaces for wildlife to exist and go about their wild ways of being. E.O. Wilson, the famed biologist, has put forward the idea of half Earth. He says that humanity needs to only use half the Earth, and we need to leave the other half the Earth for wild species. And there are a lot of efforts towards rewilding, and there's a big Half Earth project these days to figure out how to do that, how to create more protected areas, also protected areas in the oceans, because that is the primary source of all food chains, actually, is algae in the oceans. So I think stopping eating meat would be a great step. And then obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but moving towards cleaner energy systems that reduce carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, so that those wild systems can flourish. Because if the global average temperature gets too warm, they won't flourish. And some species have a narrow window of tolerance in which they can live. So we, and of course for human well-being too, we need to limit global warming to 2 degrees or C, or ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. So if we stopped eating meat and switched to clean energy, we would be well on our way to both those goals. I think building, actually, sorry, 2 more. I'm very passionate about this, but building resilient cities with green space, so that people don't have to escape and live in the suburbs and fragment open habitat into lots of little bits, is surprisingly one of the major ways to preserve wild landscapes. So if you can live in a city, and if you can contribute to building that city in a sustainable way with bike paths and walking and human-sized shops and lots of things that people need within the city, that's a big benefit for nature. And then the other one, that the Project Drawdown is a great project that identifies techniques to reduce climate change that are actually happening, and sort of quantifies their effect. And educating girls and women has one of the biggest effects on climate change, because educated girls have fewer children who use fewer resources over time, to put it very bluntly. But so in any ways that anyone can support the education of girls and women, and the movement of girls and women into STEM fields, that also has a really big impact on rectifying the balance between humans and nature. And I could go on and on, Dr. Natalie, but I'm going to stop there.
I'd like to add another thing in, and that is really about empowering people to make informed choices about whatever that is. So information empowers us, right? And when we have when we have access to information, and we have the opportunity to access and digest information, it gives us an opportunity to make an informed and empowered choice. And one area where I feel very passionate about this is around healthcare, right? So if people can be empowered around how to grow some food, so that there's access to better food. I mean, the situation of food deserts in the US and around the world, I mean, how can you expect people to be eating well if there's only a convenience store at the corner available? That is the reality for a lot of urban people who live in urban places. So empowering people through food, and then also herbal medicine. I mean, every culture of people around the world have leaned into plants as a primary source of nourishment and medicine, and in some cases even poison. You know, people use plants to fish in certain communities. And so encouraging people to if it's of interest to them, to look back to what options might be in their families around food, around herbal medicine, and to, if that doesn't resonate, then to perhaps learn about a new tradition that does resonate, but to empower people with some relatively simple at-home remedies. You know, there are so many things that people can do with diet, with sleep, with exercise, with air and light and water, and some basic herbs that can really optimize their well-being and prevent chronic disease. So that's another piece. We have another question here. What does ecological resilience look like for people who may not have the time, place, and resources to safely shelter in place? Ooh.
It's a challenging one. I saw that show up, and I started thinking about that. And I really appreciate Jason, the author of this question, bringing our attention to the inequities in the way that access to parks and safe places to walk or to be outside, the inequities in the distribution of those places, because certainly there are some urban or suburban neighborhoods where there's no safe place to walk or to visit a park, or there's no park, or there's just a lot of needles on the ground and it's not safe to be outside. So we really do need to be cognizant of the disparate access to environmental benefits, as well as the disparate distribution of environmental burdens like environmental toxicity and pollution on different groups, for different groups. And so I was thinking, what might be, I'm imagining this person who doesn't have the time, place, or resources to shelter safely in place. Maybe they're an essential worker, so they're having to go to work each day. They're not able to shelter in place at home. And what might be possible for them? So I think this idea of herbs, maybe herbal garden, maybe they have a sunny window or a balcony or a small bit of outdoor access where they could grow a few herbs in pots, and following on Dr. Natalie's comments about herbal traditions that exist in so many different cultures around the world. I'm reminded of a book about the Hmong culture in the Central Valley of California called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And these folks had just emigrated to the US. And I recall very vividly that even though they lived in a tiny apartment, they would plant the traditional herbs from their village in cracks around the driveway and the parking lot in the back of the apartment, and grow some herbs in flower pots. So I wonder if, those sort of small ways of accessing nature might be available. I wonder if this person who doesn't have much time to shelter in place, whether once in a while they might be able to take a bus to a park just to be around some trees and breathe a little bit of extra oxygen, or maybe they would have a friend with a car who might be able to help them just get outdoors once a week in a safe area. It is really difficult, and this is why we need to expand access to parks in urban areas, why we need environmental education in all schools, not just suburban schools or wealthy schools, but we need to be teaching children about their connection with nature and helping them access parks and protected areas and beaches and rivers and so on. What thoughts do you have, Dr. Natalie?
Well, I keep coming back to just these notions around, privilege and positionality, and just acknowledging that, yeah, not everybody has the opportunity to safely shelter in place. It's interesting to kind of watch the narratives that have been coming out in different aspects of society. People, they're so bored, or, oh gosh, they're doing that deep closet cleaning, and that's such a wonderful thing. And then, what a luxury it is to be bored, right? What a luxury it is to clean your closet if you have a closet to clean. So I don't know that I have any solutions. I think it's just continuing to, the invitation is to continue to look at like where the imbalances and injustices are, and to try to find some creative solutions. And that can be, from just our day-to-day living. Like, it's not uncommon for me to stop on the side of the road where there's someone who has a sign up asking for food or money. And if I've got an apple in the car, like, I'm going to toss them an apple. And that's like, might be a really seemingly small gesture, but it's like, what can we do each moment by moment to help people who don't have the same, just don't have the same things that we do. And I think one of the big challenges, again, that we're looking at is how to support people who can't safely shelter in place at home alone. Like, how do we restructure things so that community can still happen, that connection can still happen? Again, I don't really necessarily have many answers, but just more questions about this. And
I'm reminded of a local organization here in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, the Segurite Land Trust. And this is an urban Indigenous women-led land trust. And they're exactly working on this issue, is how to restore connections to the land, particularly among the Indigenous people of this land, and to restore the traditions of those Indigenous people, but also to build connections to the land among everyone who lives here in the East Bay. And so they're really bringing together environmental justice and issues of equity, justice, and inclusion together with ecological resilience. So they're working on restoring some particular parcels of land where they've gained access, and they're working with landowners to restore land. So I don't know if that exactly gets to the person who is not able to shelter in place, but it gets to some of the issues around equity and justice and diversity and economic justice. And so there are different organizations that are working to build those connections, to really recognize those connections, and work together with folks in the community to strengthen those connections. So I think all of us can support those. And just like Dr. Natalie was saying, she loves to help individuals. We can also help organizations and collectivities, certainly with our funds, with our acknowledgement, with our labor, if we have particular skills to support them with, or just finding out, how can we best support you? And then really responding to what the needs are.
Yeah, I'd like to point out just to give an example in the healthcare realm, there is an organization called Integrative Medicine for the Underserved, as well as the Integrative Healers Action Network. And these are cousin or perhaps even sister organizations that have emerged from a variety of holistic health practitioners to bring holistic healthcare to underserved populations, and also to have a network of first responders that can be present. There was a presence of this organization during the last round of significant fires in California that swept through Sonoma County last fall. So there are, I think, different initiatives in place to try to bring services and support to groups of people who might not otherwise have access.
Great.
So this next question is kind of related. How to bring ecological resilience in daily life, especially if we're working at home.
Yeah, so I think some of the things that we've been discussing, if it's safe and possible to go for a walk outside, to visit a park, to visit an area where there are some trees or some grasslands, get in touch with nature. And it really does slow the heart rate, decrease the blood pressure, decrease cortisol, all things that are really good for human health. And it puts us in touch with those other beings. And then if we're thinking about how do we support ecological resilience globally, some of those aspects that I mentioned a moment ago, if we can eat less meat, if we can withdraw our support from the meat industry, this ultimately can contribute to less land being converted to pasture or farmland. If we can support girls and women in education and in STEM, and that actually has really long-term benefits in terms of the human use of resources and how resources get allocated around the world. Even, the sun, getting some sun and some vitamin D, if it's a sunny day outside, I think can significantly boost the mood, and again connect us to the stars. Our local star is the sun. Or maybe camping out in the backyard, if there is a backyard and a tent, and being able to look up at the stars, that could connect us with the stars. What do you think, Dr. Natalie?
Well, again, I just want to acknowledge that not everybody lives in a place where they could see stars. But it's amazing how nature finds a way. I've been in some of the most interesting how shall I say this? I've been in some urban environments where nature was all but kind of, you know, stomped out. East Detroit, North Philly, Los Angeles, some of these places that have just, you know, nature has not been necessarily prioritized, and yet nature finds a way. There's a piece of grass, there's a flower, there's something that's finding its way. And one of the things that I found really helpful as the pandemic was, the reality of the pandemic was setting in and everybody was freaking out and buying all the toilet paper in the stores, and there was no toilet paper to buy. What I realized there was to buy were packs of seeds. And so I just bought some packages of seeds, and I literally, for me, it's a windowsill garden situation, but I've got, you know, a basil plant going and something else, and just like a very small measure to bring some nature into my home. And you know, it was about a $2 investment for the package of seeds. It didn't break my bank, but it brings a lot of joy to my soul, and is a way that puts me in relationship with another living piece of nature, and ultimately some yummy bagel to sprinkle into food or what. I think that just another thing to acknowledge in terms of the kind of sheltering in place and people working from home now is that people are essentially, and I said earlier, we're in this kind of inflamed state as as humanity and as a globe, but as a global culture and the planet itself. But we're also in kind of a contracted, compressed state too, in the sense that, you know, people are being expected to live at home, work at home, do childcare at home, you know, live, work, all in the same place. And that's not necessarily what's been the reality for many people. For many people, you know, the drive to work, the walk to work, the commute to work is their personal time, or an outlet, or a time to listen to a podcast or read a book or do some breath work. Who knows? So I think that we're kind of like in a pressure cooker. It's almost like we're inflamed and we're in a pressure cooker. And so we're just in this really novel time here. I'll pause there. Any other thoughts on that, Dr. Allison?
Yeah, no, I want to echo the container gardening. We've been really into it too, and our container garden has expanded this year. And there's something really restorative about nurturing and being in communion with these plants, and then harvesting some vegetables and some berries. We've gotten some raspberries that are really delicious, and just seeing, and I think also in this time of so much fear and anxiety and grief, seeing something living and growing and then producing fruit is really restorative and joyful. And this plant is flourishing. Wow. And I have these strawberries and raspberries that I grew in my own backyard. So, and I know that just anecdotally, I've noticed a line at the gardening shop in the neighborhood. I know that gardening has become popular among some people at this time. So that does seem like another way to connect with non-human nature and connect with resilience and flourishing. We should do this last question, right? Yeah. So we have a question. Are there any thoughts on nature communicating with us? Astrology was mentioned. I do think that my experience of this pandemic has been kind of as a wake-up call from nature. Yeah, hello, this is Gaia calling. Yeah, you're kind of messing up. So well, how about you reconsider what's going on? And in this conversation, we've talked about some of the ways that we think that global systems and global society can be reconsidered. You want to talk about astrology, Dr. Natalie?
Well, I also just want to echo that, yeah, this global pandemic is a big wake-up call from nature. Again, amazing that we can have this like tiny microscopic quote unquote non-living particle wreaking havoc in the human body around the globe in this way. Again, attacking the lungs of our organism, the place where we breathe and exchange air with essentially the plants and trees. And, you know, we've seen this horrid devastation in the Amazon. You know, last summer, the Amazon, it's probably still, you know, being slashed and burned as we speak, but it's, you know, our focus has kind of diverted elsewhere. But, you know, the lungs of the planet have been suffering for a very long time. And so therefore it only follows suit in this macrocosmic, microcosmic reflection that eventually something would take take up residence in our lungs and cause some serious problems there. I think we have to also just be mindful of the way that the climate has been changing and the way that we're seeing these unprecedented weather patterns, tsunamis, earthquakes that are spewing radioactive materials into the Pacific Ocean that are now showing up in my body, in my patients' bodies. We have just this unprecedented level of environmental toxicity, riding on, piggybacking on these different quote unquote natural disasters or ecologically devastating problems. The spillage of oil into the Gulf a couple of years ago. It's like, has that stopped? I don't think so. But we just kind of, something horrible happens, we're all like, and then all of a sudden it gets kind of sadly normalized in a way, and we focus, all right, let me get back to whatever I was doing, and then all of a sudden the attention keeps getting shifted. So I do think that nature is communicating with us, saying, hey, you better wake up, humans. This isn't just your planet. There are other beings here that we have an opportunity to be mindful of and sharing this beautiful space. And I don't think that we're doing a great job as a species on the planet. And astrologically, the archetypal energies that are coming through the Saturn, right now, the Jupiter Saturn Pluto complex, squaring Uranus, and then Mars has been transiting. I mean, essentially, so again, Uranus is the energy of the unexpected, bringing new things to light in a oh wow, an explosive kind of unexpected way, and it's this whole time it's been squaring these other planets, Pluto being the main one, bringing the kind of dark energies to the surface. And if you just take a look at the politics here in the US, but of course that's the global stage more or less. I mean, we have politicians who, in my opinion, are embodying all of the shadow aspects of humanity. All of the belly of the beast is getting exposed, and it's perhaps a necessary thing to bring all of the shadow into the light so that we can look at it and transmute it. And I think that these archetypal energies of specifically Uranus, Pluto are communicating that. And then we've had Saturn come through, which was a lot about the dissolution of structures and our relationship to time. I mean, how many people in this time of COVID have said, like, I've lost track of the days. I have no idea. I can't get anything done. Burning their calendars for 2020 because why bother? Things just kind of gotten wiped off. Also, Jupiter is in there right now, just kind of expanding everything. It's like, to the next level. Like, you thought it was big enough with Uranus, Pluto. Well, now we've got Jupiter being like, bam, bam, bam. And then Mars, has transited through this complex and will come into a T-square, I believe, soon. More tension, more tense energies around how do we get into action. On one hand, these are calls to action. When we see this type of explosive energy from the Uranus-Pluto complex, if you will, and Mars coming through this like driver into action, it's an invitation. Like, look at our own personal shadows, look at our collective shadows, and do the deeper, perhaps difficult work, but rewarding work to bring these beasts out of the basement. We all have our shame, our guilt, our trauma, our wounding, our sadness, our anger. Like, these are normal parts of the human experience, but we tend to demonize them. We tend to beat ourselves up about the way that we feel. And I think that leaning into practices like somatic psychology-based practices can be really helpful, because the human body is like the terrain in which we experience the interaction of these archetypes. Like, our somatic selves are where we get to see these archetypes play out, and that's through the language of emotion, in my opinion. And so the more that we can become, more that we can avail ourselves to working with our emotions and process the ones that are challenging, that are related to different types of trauma we've had, the more that we can avail ourselves to the other creative energies of the universe that want to come forth, because that's also Pluto. Pluto's creativity too. So is Uranus, it's innovation, but we've gotten a little bit, kind of stagnated because we've just been, essentially drowning in our own crap, if you will. I'll say about that much right now. Anything you want to add, Dr. Allison?
I feel like that's really a good place to leave us, where we look within and deal with our own crap the way that we can. Thank you for an incredibly fascinating and transformative conversation, Dr. Natalie. I think we should bring back Jason to close us out.
Yeah. Thank you,
Oh,
Dr. Allison.
that was so wonderful and informative and relevant to these times. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. And thank you all so much for attending tonight. We hope that you will join us for more of our upcoming events. Our next event will be on Embracing Anxiety, an online conversation with Carla McLaren and Elizabeth Markle on June 24th at 7 p.m. Pacific time. We have posted the link in the chat if you want to learn more. This conversation was recorded tonight. If you would like to watch it again or share it with the community, it can be found at this same link on YouTube or on our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us, and good night.